All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, Building a Culture of Assessment with Future in Mind. I'll have Keston introduce himself, then I'll introduce myself. Go ahead, Keston.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everybody. Keston Fulcher here from James Madison University. We're located in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I'm a professor of graduate psychology. I teach in our assessment and measurement PhD program, and I am an improvement strategist. So I help other universities think about how to improve learning at scale. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Keston. All right. And my name is Joe Levy. I serve as the Associate Vice Provost of Accreditation and Quality Improvement at Excelsior University, which is based in Albany, New York, but mostly online. I'm physically located in Chicago, Illinois. And in addition to my day job, I also serve as one of the board of directors members, an open course manager for the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders organization, which provides assessment for assessment support and community and resources for folks engaging in student affairs assessment. And my day job, since it was a long title, I oversee all things accreditation as well as assessment of student learning. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to, oh no, I start off.
Yeah, you start,
But
Joe. Kick us
yeah,
off.
so just for context as we go through, and feel free, I know I put in the chat for folks to introduce themselves. Feel free to also, if you have questions in there, pose them as we go along. But Keston and I, we came together to come up with some tips around building a culture of assessment. So we'll go back and forth talking about those tips, and then talk about what we think is the future and what to think about. So we'll be excited for your all's reactions and thoughts as we go along the way, and try and do some questions on the fly, but also make sure we have some time at the end to engage with you all as we go. So thankful to have you here. Keep introducing yourselves. Great to see everybody. But I'm going to start with tip number 4. So we have 4 tips. So we're counting down to 1. So the tip that I have is around prioritizing capacity building. So assessment practices are one of the top areas of concern across accreditors. Now, there's been this shift in assessment, especially concerns, is it used to be for a while that people really struggled with just doing assessment. And so people would say like, well, gosh, if you get any reports actually turned in, like, that's a win. The conversation, thankfully, has moved a bit from folks not engaging to now people will engage and they'll turn in their reports, but maybe that engagement isn't as meaningful or as authentic as it could have been. And so then we're struggling with, well, we got these reports, but what's anybody actually doing with this? And, one of the things that for me, I've learned to not take it personally, especially on the assessment side, that it's not always that employees don't want to do the work or don't like assessment. There can be, barriers that are preventing them. One of those barriers is they just may not know what to do, right? And this is a reality that goes beyond assessment. I mean, we in higher education are still largely in a model where even from the faculty side, we prioritize work experience over knowledge of teaching and learning practices, right? Well, if you're a chemist, we'll hire you to teach chemistry as opposed to, making sure you have knowledge of teaching and learning scholarship, right? And best ways to teach folks, right? We think, well, chemistry, so you can learn the teaching stuff as you go. But the reality is, a lot of times with assessment, people just don't know how to do it. They weren't trained in it. They don't know the best way to go about it. That doesn't mean they don't like it. It doesn't mean they dislike it. It just means they may not know where to start. And so it's important for us, one, to recognize that going in and to anticipate that and to then look to best meet those needs, right? If we know they're going to need some capacity building and introduction and familiarity with assessment, then let's best do that rather than wait and be reactive and ask them to raise their hand. But instead, let's anticipate that. Let's welcome them into the process. So really, this is the sign you've been looking for, right? Like, we need to be actively, intentionally engaging people in professional development, training, and capacity building especially when we're concerned around building a culture of assessment and making sure folks across the board have the assessment skills and resources they need to do the work. Um, it's important. And the great thing about anticipating it and intentionally planning it is we can find ways to tie it together and embed it in other capacity building things, right? With curriculum design, time management, strategic planning, initiative strategizing. We can tie this in with that so that as we're talking about those components, we can say, this is where assessment fits into that, or this is how your work in assessment can lead to or contribute to this thing. So that's my big tip around being intentional around that capacity building component for our people.
All right. I've got tip number 3. We're going to work up to 1. So tip number 3 is having an improvement mindset when it comes to assessment. And Joe, if you could advance the slide. So you might imagine that we're out in space and we have this big space center and it's about learning improvement. And then we have an astronaut out there who's the assessment astronaut. And if y'all can see that arrow, that assessment astronaut is going away from improvement. And for those of you who've been around for a little while, the 2 main purposes of assessment are typically thought about as being accountability and improvement. And so that's not good. Now, not pictured in the slide is where that astronaut is headed. It is to the planet of unread reports. And nobody wants to be there in their journey. So, how can we put that together? Joe, if you could advance the slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a story about a pig. And since we have the space theme, I'm going to go ahead and put the pig in a spacesuit. But there's this old saying, and it stemmed from agriculture. And the saying goes, a pig never fattened because it was weighed. And I've heard that as a attack, if you will, on assessment, because the analogy to assessment is a student never learned more simply because they're assessed. About 10 years ago, I worked with a couple of graduate students, and we thought, how can we take that pig metaphor and use it to our advantage? And so we came up with a little slogan, and it was, you've got to first weigh the pig, then you got to feed the pig, and then you've got to weigh the pig again. And if you can hit the slide a couple times. And so if you see that that pig is bigger after the feeding, then you're thinking, okay, well, that's actually improvement. So you have to, again, weigh pig, feed pig, weigh pig. And how does this translate when we're talking about assessment? If you could advance the slide. So it's essentially these 3 components. It's assess, intervene, and then reassess. So we have to figure out where students are at a particular point in time, and then we have to intervene. And by intervene here, I'm talking about making a change in the learning environment, and then reassess to see if indeed that intervention was effective. And as you just saw there too, you see how intervene got bigger? Because in the formula, assess, intervene, reassess, there's sort of 3 terms, and they're all of 2/3 of that's assessment, assess and reassess. But if you were to proportionally put how much time and effort goes to each of those 3 steps, really intervention is the main part. Like something has to change in the learning environment so students could be more successful. And so that's something that I talk about a lot when I'm talking about improvement at scale, is that we have to have all these parts integrated, the assessment piece and the intervention piece. And the intervention isn't just like a side part of assessment. It's actually the main component, but we need to build assessment around it to show that it's effective. Joe?
All right. So, in addition to thinking about those interventions and intentionality to this work, one of the things that I want to speak to is engagement and transparency as we're looking to build out a culture. So first, I want to say that assessment is not a solo practice, nor is it serving a small population. We're concerned with student learning for all of our students, and we're concerned with that regardless of where learning's happening, inside or outside of the classroom. I worked with Presence in Modern Campus to make this slide a couple of years ago because I kept trying to explain to people that assessment is assessment. It doesn't matter whether it's inside the classroom, outside of the classroom. And so I made this layout to show like they both have intentional interventions. They both have purposeful content. Then they both have integrated measures. It just looks really different, right? Academic, it's much more standardized because regardless of the discipline, you have your courses, right? And you have your tests and your exams, and it's pretty familiar on the academic side of the house. Whereas with co-curricular and student services, it wildly varies, right? The way that academic advising serves students is very different than career services, which is different than residence life, which is different than orientation. And so their interventions look different. The purposeful content they're delivering is different, and their measures can be different. It's just not as standardized. But we take a step back, assessment is still happening in both places. And therefore, we should be making sure that we're talking together about student learning and we're working across campus to bring those insights together. And as Ketchum was saying, that we then think about these interventions to see where the change is happening and that it's not always happening in one place or another. And it's not just about having people from across campus participate. We need to make sure we have diverse perspectives and people whose positionality complements or is different from our own to help with member checking and checking our own bias, both as what we think, what we speak, and how we act. And so how can we have representative perspectives for the populations and interventions that we're discussing, right? And that includes, students. They're our biggest key population. And yet I'd be willing to bet for the people on this call, you're not regularly talking to students. They're not part of your assessment committees. They're not part of these processes that we're engaging with, or they're also not a key person who's getting that report, right? That unread report, the land of unread reports. Students should be a big population there wanting to read those, but we're often aren't sharing it with them. And so how can we be thinking about the different ways in which we're approaching and intentionally looking to engage these populations in the work that we're doing? And so this is me. My name's also Joe, but this does track for me with food, but it's also true on the assessment front, right? There's tons of information to share, and all sorts of people want to hear and know about it. Faculty, sharing with other faculty, sharing with other staff, sharing from faculty to staff and staff to faculty, supervisors, leadership, frontline folks, if they weren't involved in the process, part-time employees, employers, the ones hiring our students, alumni, the community, so forth and so on. All of these people have a vested interest in our student success. And yet we're not usually talking about student learning. And that's the core of what they're looking for us to do, is help increase the knowledge, skills, and competencies of our students. And so why aren't we talking about that? So for me, I think assessment offers this really awesome opportunity that we can be storytellers on behalf of our students, and even better, use our students to tell that story of how they're learning, right? And we can be, from a culture building perspective, empowering others to share those stories, celebrating our strengths, excitedly talking about pinpointing areas we're going to look to improve, and signaling to students where things are going to be better, right? And how their learning environment is going to improve based off of what we're learning and what feedback we're getting from them. And we can be using our voice to lift others up, to advocate on behalf, and point to data and evidence that they collected, and invite them into leadership conversations or spaces they may not traditionally be. And that's a role I love to play, especially since the dynamic is usually that a lot of times learning conversations are just happening on the HLC side of the house, or sorry, the academic side of the house. And so how can we be bringing staff into those conversations and bringing student affairs to the table to use learning outcomes as a common ground and common language to talk about student success?
The next tip is looking under the hood. And so, Joe, so you all get ready to write in chat. Okay. So you're looking at two spaceships here. They look identical, but one of them is a lot better than the other. So if you can type in chat, oh, Joe, you got ahead of me a little bit. Well,
Sorry.
The cat is out of the bag. Go ahead and flip it, Joe. So it is the bottom rocket that is a lot better. And the first one isn't working at all. Now, from the outside, these look the same. And why is that? Like, why is one spaceship working better than the other one? Joe? So you have to look under the hood, right? You have to see what's going on in that spaceship. And so the one on the top might have had an engine that, if you look closely, looked like the one on the left. I mean, it's dilapidated, parts don't work. And on the right, this is one that's ready to go. It's great. And that's what sometimes our programs are like, whether you're in student affairs or academic affairs. If you see it in the student handbook about this particular program, and it's listed out and it says, hey, this is what this program is supposed to do. Well, it looks fine on paper, but is it actually effective? Well, you're going to have to dive in a little deeply to check it out. Joe? So there's two questions that you might ask in terms of, is a spaceship going to work? I mean, the first is, do you have parts that are good? And so you're hoping before you ever fly that spaceship that the components of it have been really studied well. And perhaps they've been decades, or if it's a spaceship, maybe hundreds or thousands of years in the making, and it's proven and you know it works. But the second part, did you use it as instructed? So even if you have a great spaceship, but you have somebody who is the pilot and they're not following the correct procedures, then the spaceship still may not fly. And so there's some analogous things that we're going to get to in a moment that come to programs. So there's components of the programs that we hope are going to be effective for students to learn. Is there research behind that? Do we know they should work? And then is the person or the people who are delivering those components, are they actually delivering them as intended? So these are questions that we should ask ourselves, not only for about spaceships that we might fly in outer space, but also about our programs, whether they be in student affairs or in academic affairs. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. So I do want to pause before we head in to talk about future directions. Just want to see if anybody has any questions or things they want us to clarify over any of those tips before we get into the future directions thing, especially because we're doing good on time. We have time to field any questions. So you can put those in the chat or, oh, Yay Chen, go for it.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm here to I'm actually working on a project that creates assessment for administrative units in higher education. So I saw that you were mentioning that assessments is not just within classrooms, within academics, it's also outside of that, and it could include like all the other stakeholders. So, what I wanted to ask is, what do you think is the main difference between assessments for academic perspective and for um, other perspective from like administrative units?
Yeah. So one caveat before I answer, because I know even on assessment listservs, it's been something that people will say is exactly the wording you used, right? Administrative units. And so sometimes they're, I guess, aligning more with my definition of administrative units, where they're talking about a unit that is almost strictly back of the house, internal to the institution, does not interface or have interventions with the students at all, right? So I'm thinking, I don't like, let's say, internal like facilities unit that like helps coordinate booking rooms, right? So they only work with faculty and staff and administrators on booking rooms. They don't talk to students. They don't work with students. So for those entities, I mean, you're a bit doing more of evaluation, and you're not really getting into student learning at all. And so you're just looking at evaluation. Although sometimes those units have learning outcomes, they're just not for students, they're for faculty and staff, right? Like I think about our IT staff who I rely on heavily when I have an issue. But they also expect when they show me something that maybe I will retain that knowledge and not have to call them again. And so for those areas, I say, well, take the playbook you have for assessment and just swap out student and put in, faculty or staff or whoever that population is. But what I would say too, in case that's not what you were talking about, you're talking more about kind of student affairs, co-curricular units. I think the biggest difference is that academic affairs, there just is a heavier data component and requirement expectation of the student, right? Um, Now, I'm sure faculty will be quick to say, like, well, students don't always attend class, but by and large, students have to go to class. They have to turn in their papers. They have to turn in their assignments. They have to do those things to get their grades, to get their credits, to graduate. And so there's your data. Your data is baked in, right? It is required for students to participate and give you that. Whereas on the student affairs and student services side, that's largely not the case. It's pretty rare for institutions to have many requirements for students to, take advantage of the services and use them often. Career services often says like, yeah, we'll get like one shot with a student. They'll come in, they'll bring a resume, we'll fix it up for them, and then they'll never come back, which is a good sign for us, right? We gave them good feedback, but they never come back to tell us how they improved it or what their outcome was. So that's one of the biggest challenges or biggest differences is it's not as guaranteed of participation and data outside of the classroom, which makes the work a lot more challenging. But there's also a lot of freedom in that too, because you're not stuck in a course structure and you have a bit more creativity you can infuse in the ways you're interacting with students. So yeah, does that help? I don't know, Keston, if you have anything to share too.
Yeah, well, I really liked your answer, Joe. That's a great question. One of the differences that I see is that basically it's like, what is the outcome that you're after? So typically when we're talking about academic affairs and student affairs, a lot of the conversations around student learning and development. And so that's the dependent variable that you're trying to make a difference upon. For administrative units, it usually has to do with still outcomes, but it might be in terms of efficiency or other types of more, well, I should say, maybe outputty types outcomes. From my experience, I've found that administrative units and helping them is tougher than academic affairs and to student affairs to some extent too. And here's why: is like on the academic affairs side, you might have a program that's physics, and then you have another program that is in poetry, and they're pretty different, but they still have student learning intact. They still have the same kind of curricular structure that one might think through. They're still going to use some kind of assessment instrument to capture student learning. Whereas if you've got the registrar's office versus athletics versus accounts payable, whatever it is, those things, they're so diverse in terms of how you think about doing the assessment. And so I found that when I consulted with administrative units, I almost had to do it on a one-to-one basis after a general introduction to assessment, just because they're so different in terms of what their outcomes might look like. Yeah, great question.
And then Keston, I don't know if you see Steve's question in the chat, but he's talking about RTI response to intervention, Steve, but saying that it's demonstrated to have a very large effect size on positively influencing student achievement. Isn't that essentially weighing, intervening, and weighing?
Yeah. Hi, Steve. So Steve and I go way back. Great to see you here. Yeah, I think very similar concepts. So yeah, the idea is it's intervention focused, and that you want to have assessment to know, where a student typically is, after think carefully about the intervention to make sure it meets the need of that particular student, and then reassess to see if that intervention was indeed effective. And there's also what I like about RTI, there's always an examination of, is this the right level of intervention for this student to be successful? So it's very customized there. So in spirit, very aligned with RTI. Usually when I'm talking about learning improvement. So they assess, intervene, and reassess. It's usually at higher levels. So I'm thinking about at the program level. So if you think about your own programs, for those folks who are out there, you need to think about all students who are touched by that program. What are the interventions that you're running that you think are going to be successful, and how do you know it at scale? So a really large scale, for example, might be general education, because you're hoping that all undergraduate students pick up certain skills. Like, how do you know that they pick up those skills, and what are the interventions that you have that will help them achieve those skills? On student affairs, it may be something like orientation. So if you've got orientation and all your students go through orientation, what do you want them to know they could do because of orientation, and how do you ensure that those interventions actually hit all those folks?
Thanks, Keston. And Shakar just asked if they could reiterate tip number 4. And so that first tip we had was prioritize capacity building. All right. Any other question? Well, I promise we'll have time after we run through the future direction piece to talk to. Oh, here we go. What recommendations do you have for those of us struggling to work with department units with leadership that doesn't value assessment work and therefore perpetuates the mindset that assessment work is a requirement, busy work, and or not important to them? Love this question. And for me, one, I try to level set on defining what assessment is and making sure we're talking about the same purpose of work, because I think too often assessment can be reduced to numbers, reports, or as Keston shared, like folks can think about it as just a means toward accreditation, a means toward compliance, as opposed to this process of learning improvement, right? And this intentional way to understand what's actually happening and quantifying what the work we're doing. And I say all the time, I have this comic strip I love using where there's this kid that it's 2 kids and there's a dog, and the one kid says, "Yeah, I taught my dog how to whistle." The other kid like leans in, says, "I don't hear him whistling." He said, "Well, I taught him. I didn't say he learned it." And I think that's perfect for assessment because we put a ton of effort and we have very qualified, smart people who plan interventions, who use literature, who use good practices to put together an intervention. And then students go through that. And we cannot just assume that everything will go according to plan. And we can't just assume that the outcome is always going to be the same. And so it is a process where we need to check that. And where it's not meeting our expectations, look to make changes in hopes to improve that learning environment, improve that outcome. And so when I break down what assessment is and what it can provide us, I've never had a leader say that's not important. I've never had a leader say we don't need to know students are learning, right? But what they will push back on is administrative process or red tape or standardization without customization. And so sometimes it's really just making sure we're on the same page and talking about what the real barriers are or what the real problems might be, because that's even when you get to faculty and staff, sometimes they'll really dig their heels in and say they don't like assessment. And it's not really that they don't like assessment, they just maybe don't like being told what to do, or they don't like a process being done to them and not having a voice in it. And so then when you give them voice and involve them in the process and let them know, to Keston's point, we're going to work on one-on-one, and this can be whatever's meaningful and manageable and useful to you. Wow, I didn't know assessment could be that. It's like, yeah, it can be, right? So I think sometimes it's really just about getting on the same page and understanding what those barriers are, and what can be the promise for the future.
Joe, I can give a couple
go ahead.
additional comments too. And Joanna, what a great question. I think anybody who's worked in assessment for a while has encountered that and tried to work out what their strategy is with folks. I really agree with a lot of what Joe said. and I'll pick one particular part, is that idea of like, if you're first coming to somebody, the first time that they meet you and you say, this report is due, and that is likely true, and you're likely helping them make sure that their program is accredited, but they'll still see you as a person who's asking for a report. And from their perspective, they may not see the value in what assessment may provide. If you get the opportunity, and a lot of this comes with time, is if you get the opportunity to talk with somebody like outside of that space a little bit before first, so you can have a relationship and have a conversation to figure out what they like, then I think it's a lot easier to have the other conversation. It's also a lot easier to talk about assessment when you know what they value. And so something that I ask folks a lot of times, it was like, hey, when you and your colleagues get together and when you're excited about what students have learned, or if there's some concerns that you have, skills that you wish students have, but they don't, what are they? And you get them talking about that. And most folks in student affairs and academic affairs, if you ask a question like that, they'll have thought about those types of things and they can share it. And then if in your mind, you can kind of process through that in an assessment lens and just say, have you considered doing X or Y? And that might illuminate some of the questions that you have about that. And then I think you get in a position where people are start to think, like Joe said, how can assessment be meaningful to them?
Yeah. All right, we'll take this as the last question before we move on. But this is for you, Keston. Jessica asked, what are some ways to stop reports going to the planet of the unread, especially when we're required to submit data through a standardized form and can't make a fancy visual? I know my supervisors have a deluge of stuff to read, but I want to make sure they read mine.
Yeah, I tell you what, the planet of the unread has an exceptional gravitational force. There are tons of those reports that go that way. Well, one thing that you can do, and a lot of schools have done this, is actually have a committee or group that provides feedback on the assessment report. And oftentimes this is providing feedback on the quality of the assessment process, not necessarily if that program met their benchmarks or not. But the idea is that at least that communicates that people value assessment and are willing to have kind of a dialogue about it. When we started doing that process, we had one person who wrote this like diatribe. It was like a 2-page diatribe in a 20-page report. And I know that person was thinking we weren't going to read it, but we did read it. And for the most part, folks appreciate that feedback. I mean, sometimes if you give folks feedback, whether that's in student affairs or academic affairs, that folks might be a little bit resistant to it. And so trying to make that feedback as positive and as constructive as possible is a good thing. But I'll tell you what's worse than people being reactive to getting feedback, and that's getting no feedback. Because if people learn that, hey, this is just a report that goes nowhere and nobody reads it, then that word gets out quickly and people are going to stop trying. One last addition to that too is if you're sort of in the middle position where you might be managing assessment at an institution and you're reading these reports, you also want people to hear the good stories. So if you have a way to acknowledge these exemplary assessment reports or exemplary processes, maybe a unit is really using students in their assessment process well, make sure you note that and figure out a way to get that up to upper administrators and say, hey, X, Y, and Z program are doing an excellent job of assessment. Would you mind spending a time just to reach out, even with an email, and let them know that what a good job they're doing with assessment? So I think those are some ways that you can let people know that you're listening and caring about what they're doing with their program and with assessment.
Yeah, and to that end, a quick thing I would add is that if you want to get a certain audience's attention, cater your sharing style to them and what they care about, right? So, not that your boss doesn't care about your report, and they probably are the ones helping hold you accountable to turning that report in, but they may be more reactive to you giving them an email with 5 highlights right? Or a quick presentation distilling the key points from the report that most align with pressing questions, initiatives, and decisions they have to make. Or I think about, if there's, at my last institution, we had a lot of examples, and I'm trying to encourage diversity of sharing of results. And so some opposite, like our tutoring center took their assessment data and folded it into their advertisements. They said, look, students who use tutoring are X% more likely to receive a higher grade on their paper than students who don't. And so here's our hours, right? Here's how to contact us and how to get hold of us, right? So that was them using their assessment results in an advertisement, in a flyer. Now, was that everything in the report? No. Was it, the most important thing? Maybe not, but it's probably the most important thing to the students. Certainly caught their attention, right? So that was an effective way to share things. So that's one thing I would say too, is it may not always be that the best thing for them to read and engage with is your actual standard report. And so, especially if you're bound to that, then think of the creative ways to share the information otherwise. All right, good questions, but I want to make sure we get through our future orientation here, and then we'll field some questions here at the end. Thank you all. Okay, so future directions. Couple thoughts from me. One, and some of these are section headers from a chapter that Natasha Jankowski and I just wrote about future assessment directions. So this first is student-centered education, right? I firmly believe we are heading towards, we will be heading towards an environment where higher ed is going to need to customize and personalize that journey for students in order to make it as meaningful and useful for them. And so, whether that's pathways, competency-based learning, micro, stackable credentials, and just-in-time credentials, assessment's going to need to be more customized and personalized too. And so how can we be better at centering our students and thinking specifically about assessment? What's one thing we can do to think about their journeys, think about the individualization of that, but also have some type of standardization or comparability as we're thinking about, equivalent learning outcomes across students. I also think we're really going to move to kind of blending roles, and the division between like a faculty member and a staff member is really going to blur, because it's going to be less lecture and more learning guide, right? Especially if we have more things that students can do on their own, then we're going to have this blending of academic and student affairs, and it would be hard to distinguish between who's the teacher versus the mentor versus the advisor versus the assessor versus the career coach. The students will just have people giving them guidance and support in their learning journey. They already might not be drawing the clear conclusions as to who's in what area. They just know who can help them. And so how can we prepare for that now, right? And how can we break down those silos and already be talking and sharing information with one another and strategizing around interventions to support students through their journey, knowing that we're going to need to come together at some point. As far as some resources to help as we're navigating the future, NILOA has a ton of occasional papers, case studies, toolkits, but they also have this structured resource of materials for common assessment elements that's nestled on their page from this LARC grant project. And so I know it's real small there, but they have these different tabs, and each tab has expandable areas with information around assessment that you can check out. I also want to plug the online open course from the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. That organization, Student Affairs Assessment Leaders, they have a journal, blogs, webinars, podcast, and they have this MOOC that runs once a year. It's 8 self-paced modules with discussion boards, quizzes, written assignments, video lectures. There's both required as well as further learning reading. So if you want to really dig into certain topics, you can do that, and we help set you off on a track and course to do so. And we have both small groups as well as some optional live sessions for people to check out. And we cover all these things for assessment. And I really want to kind of sit on this slide for a minute to say, this is what we cover. So if you're interested or want to build your capacity in any of these topics, I'd encourage you to check out the course, despite the fact that it's run by a student affairs organization and has student affairs in the title of the course. Because, like I said at the beginning, assessment is assessment. And so if you need help with assessment planning, we got good information in there for you, whether you're academic affairs or student affairs. And arguably, if you're academic affairs, you could stand to learn, what the nuances might be or what potentially differences might be with student affairs assessment, but there's still some common information and good resources for you in there. So you can learn more about the student affairs organization in general, that link, and then the open course link is there. I'm also timely pitching this because the course runs once a year, and it's this great resource, but it only runs once a year, and the enrollment actually closes on Friday. So if you're like, oh, that sounds really cool, and I just want to know what it's like, I encourage you to sign up. We do not, this is first and foremost a resource. So do not feel any shame of signing up and then not completing, or like, we don't care. We just want it to be a resource to help people. So if you're at all interested, feel free to check it out, because it's free. But then otherwise it's going to run again usually runs February to late March. So it'll be open again next year. But if you want a preview of it, feel free to sign up and check it out. Testing.
Thanks, Joe. Talking about those future directions. And I mentioned these two rocket ships earlier. You might recall the one at the top looks great, but just doesn't work at all. And the one below has got better outcomes, meaning that it's going faster. But like, why? What's the difference between the two? And it has to do with what is under the hood. Joe? And so if we take this to a academic program or a student affairs program, and imagine that we're looking at ethical reasoning. So that's a really important construct and important really in the curriculum and in the co-curriculum. And so you have to think about, well, if we wanted to help students act ethically, how do we do that? What some folks might do is they might have a bunch of people in the room and like, I'm going to try A, and I'm going to try B, and I'm going to try C. And so it's very much of a trial and error type approach. I'm going to give a shout out to my colleague, Sarah Finney. Some of y'all may know her. She's at James Madison University, and she leads our student affairs assessment. And she talks a lot about program theory, that you shouldn't just choose interventions willy-nilly. You should have in mind how different types of interventions should affect certain outcomes. And for something complex like acting ethically, that you're going to have some inputs to start off with, some different interventions at different levels. Then there's intermediate outcomes that you want to get to, and then ultimately the distal outcome, or the ultimate outcome, which is acting ethically. And you can see how they're pulling in literature like Perry and Kohlberg and Gilligan and Kahneman, all to help make this process about this is what's on paper we think should work. So it's not important for you to know all the details here. What's important to think about is that if you're thinking about these important constructs, these important skills, this important knowledge that we want students to have after they graduate, we want to have a logic model that is based on past research, on theory, in order to work them through there. So that's one component of it. And this is from some work that Kristen Smith, one of my doctoral advisees a long time ago, and Sarah Finney had worked on. Joe? And the other piece of that is implementation fidelity. So imagine in the past scenario where you have this awesome program theory about what you and your institution can do to affect students' ethical reasoning. And the interventions are all laid out. And you know, if those are implemented well, that you're likely to see this result with students. But guess what? Sometimes what's on paper, the plan we have on paper, isn't fully addressed. And it's those gaps in implementation fidelity that may be the issue. So thinking back to the rocket, it may be the case where the components of the rocket ship are great. They might be, the most expensive parts, the parts that have been tested, they're great. But if you have a pilot in there that isn't following the procedures, that rocket still may not run. And I'll give you one more example for implementation fidelity that Sarah and other folks often used, and it has to do with healthcare. And so if you imagine that I've got a rash on my forearm and I go to a physician and I ask the doctor, I say, gosh, I got this bad rash. Can you help me out? They look and they say, I think it's so-and-so rash. They say, Keston, I want you to take this pill twice a day, every day for 2 weeks. Okay. Then I come back to the physician and I'm like, hey, look at my arm. I still got the rash. So one conclusion that the physician might jump to is that, oh, I'm sorry, Keston, the pills didn't work for you. But what's the other question that they might ask? Did you take those pills as I prescribed? Did you take that pill twice a day for every day for 2 weeks? By the way, that happens all the time in healthcare where people don't follow the implementation strategy as they should. It also, if you look under the hood of a program and you're looking like what you have on paper and you see the degree to which it's followed, there's often a huge disconnect between what's on paper and what's actually applied. But you have to actually collect that data to know if it's an implementation issue. Joe? So if the student affairs programs, this could be academic affairs programs too, and you have a poor outcome, so students aren't achieving what you hope they could achieve, you have to ask yourself a couple different questions. Is it a case where maybe the components in the first place aren't good? That maybe you just chose things to do and you don't know if those interventions are effective or not. Perhaps they're not effective. And it could be that there was poor fidelity, or it could be this poor fidelity. I mean, you could have, again, the best components of your student affairs program, the best components of your academic program, but if the instructor or the facilitator doesn't follow through, you could have an issue. Let me give you an example of that. Some of y'all may have been in this situation. Like, imagine you've got a really well laid out program, and there's this course that students take for methodology, for example, in this program. And imagine that the main instructor, for whatever reason, got sick and they have to get somebody new. Let's say they just tap me on the shoulder, Keston, I need you to teach this section and you're teaching the first class tomorrow. Well, how good do you think I'm going to be? It doesn't matter how good the materials are, right? I'm already starting behind, and my level of implementation is not going to be as good as somebody who has done this before and prepared as they should. And so it's likely that the outcomes of the students that I'm going to have in my class are going to be worse because there's an implementation problem in that particular case. So, Joe? So here's the point to all this, is that oftentimes we have programs that are working at different levels, and sometimes the programs aren't working as well as we would like. The issue is if we don't know why the program is not performing as well as it should, there's not too much we can do. And so we want to know more about the components to see if there's some theoretical and empirical evidence that it should be effective. And we also need to know about implementation to start making those inferences to be able to be like, I know if I change this, it has a likely chance of affecting students positively. So going back to what you had originally, Joe, it's like the more you know, right? So the more you know about the program, then the more you have the opportunity to fix it. And fix may not be the best word. I'd say, enhance it or to make it more effective. All right, Joe. So I wanted to go to this next slide, and this has to do with the assessment model that we use at JMU. And I'll give credit again to Sarah for adding these components, but most of you likely are familiar with some kind of assessment cycle. And a couple of things that is different about our cycle that we've added that were not in there originally are, one, what's in the middle. So you can see that program theory is in there. So it's determine how and why the program is expected to work. And that should be the center of assessment. And I'm going to say a word on the side, a learning system, because as you start going into how to make assessment work, you have to think about the intervention too. So I think it's more of like a learning system. And the other thing that is a little different about this assessment model than some you might see is if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you look at fidelity data. And then right beside it is the learning outcomes data. So the idea here is that if it's a rocket ship, it's like on the outcome side, like we know how fast that rocket ship goes. And on the other side, we know like what did the pilot do? Did they follow the manual as expected to get the rocket to fly like it should? So similar here, if you're looking at a program and you're looking at, say, student belongingness in an orientation program, it was like, okay, did students show an increase in belongingness after an orientation program? And what degree was the fidelity followed there too? Having those pieces together, like what's happening on the ground and programming and the outcomes data, incredibly powerful. The other parts look pretty similar to what you've seen before, but it's that insertion of program theory and fidelity data can really make a difference. Joe? So I'd like to highlight a couple of resources that we have. And so we have something called SAS, and that's our Student Affairs Support Services. And this is the website that Sarah and her graduate students over time have come up with. Just a tremendous amount of resources about the assessment cycle, including a lot of examples with program theory and implementation fidelity too. For those who are interested in academic affairs, if you can just type in JMU and assessment, you can get to our main webpage, and we've got tons of resources there about academic degree programs, gen ed, and so forth. So that's our free resource. And Joe? Next one. So our second one is our Assessment 101 workshop. So let me give you a little bit of background about this. That many years ago, we had a lot of folks who were going into assessment in academic degree programs or in student affairs, and they might have been the kind of folks who were like voluntold, like you're in the biology program, you're going to be the person who writes the biology report, or you are going to be the lead of our health center and you're going to write the assessment report, but they didn't have much background in that area. And so we found people really struggling with assessment because they weren't given the space and the time to be able to do assessment well. There's a couple of comments earlier where folks were talking about people really struggling with assessment, not seeing it being useful. Well, we had a lot of pushback too. And when we started asking people why they feared assessment or didn't like it, about 2/3, 3/4 of people, it was really because they didn't feel confident in being able to use assessment. So we created something called Assessment 101 at our institution, which is a week-long workshop on assessment. We thought, hey, if you can just spend the time up front, then you might have much better luck, much better happiness, much better utility with assessment on the back end. So this is something that we started internally just for JMU folks. And then we got out and we were talking about Assessment 1 at different conferences, our regional accreditor, SAC-COC. We talked about it at the Assessment Institute, talked about it at NASPA and ACPA. And then all of a sudden we got these requests, people like, oh, can I come to it? And so eventually we expanded it out. And now we have people coming from all over the world to our Assessment 101. So our Assessment 101 that we're offering this year is in June, so June 3rd through June 7th. And the assessment model that you learned about, that's what we teach on. And so there's a lot of content on every part of the assessment cycle, but we spend a disproportionate amount of time, if you will, on program theory or implementation fidelity, because we feel like that's been a missing part to the puzzle. So if you're interested in that, let me know. You can find out more information on the website. And yeah, that's like a boot camp style. So this is like, try not to do anything else that week and just concentrate on assessment. And if you do that, then most folks have a really good outcomes. And we have done assessment, by the way. We look at students' attitudes and also their some of their skill areas at the very beginning, and then we reassess at the end. And I think it's something like a 1 standard deviation increase in both that we found in Assessment 101. So thank you, Joe.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We appreciate you coming. We have a couple minutes left here for some questions. So if you want to put those in the chat or raise your hand, we can call on you. But we hope you found information helpful, useful, and Gosh, we can talk about this stuff all day. And I really appreciate some of the stuff Keston was sharing there. The fidelity component is certainly such an important thing that um, we're often not asking and we're often not examining in typical assessment practice and with these interventions. So it's really a great uh, uh, perspective and sort of new layer to fold into your processes that can really elevate your culture if that's not something that's there already. Getting a lot of thanks in the chat, which is good. Hey, Bill, thanks for coming. Any last questions? Final word from anybody? Okay. Well, appreciate you all. I'll go ahead and stop the recording.